Let me tell you all about how I made this amazing bakery worthy sourdough bread, and I'll share every little detail from starter to bread. But before we start, there are three things that I need you to know. The first being that this is probably one of the best sourdough breads I've ever had in my life. And I know you don't know me from nowhere, but hear me out when I say that. Number two, I'm not a natural born baker, so if I can do it, so can you. The third is that even though this bread is easy to make, it takes time, especially if you have to make the starter. But in the end, all the time invested will be worth it. Hello and welcome to Munch. If you know how to make a starter, then you can skip to this part right here. If, however, you're as clueless as I was at the start of this adventure, then you're at the right place. So don't move while I take you back a few days before this very moment. I didn't really know where to start, so I asked ChatGPT for help. And no shame in my game. And boy oh boy, did she deliver. So ChatGPT told me I'd need a jar, ideally transparent or at least see-through with a minimum capacity of 500 mLs. Water, filtered or boiled at room temperature. Plain white flour. The strong bread one works best for consistency and that's the one I used. And the kitchen scale, which is optional but I highly recommend it for accuracy. I didn't want to run any risks, so I used the scale through every step of the way. And step one for me was to weigh the jar, and this one weighed 210 grams. And this is important because I'll use this information throughout the starter making process. For day one, all that had to be done was mixing 60 grams of flour with 60 grams of water. And for reference, if you don't have a scale, this should be more or less 4 heaped tablespoons of flour or the equivalent to half a cup, and more or less 4.5-ish tablespoons of water, which equates to approximately a quarter of a cup. I did it exactly as instructed by ChatGPT, gave it a good mix, and I thought I'd stick this white tape to the jar to trace the day-by-day progress of my starter. In the meantime, I've seen other people use a ribbon instead. Use whatever you have handy, but it's important that you track the progress because a good indicator that your starter is working is when it grows, and marking the jar makes it easier to tell. And after mixing the two ingredients, the jar must be covered, but not entirely. And you can use a cling film, for example, poking some holes to allow it to breathe. But my jar had a lid, so that's what I used, without fully covering, and went about my day. So this was the beginning of day 2, and what I noticed upon opening my jar was that the starter had some small bubbles and a very mild, tangy smell. And it had grown. Nothing crazy, but I thought I was on a good track. So according to ChatGPT, I had to take half of the content out and add once again 60 grams of flour and 60 grams of water. This process is what it's called feeding. And that's when knowing the weight of the jar comes in handy because in my case, all I had to do was deduct 210 grams to the total weight and divide it by 2. But this is only if you want to be precise. But if you don't have a scale, don't worry. You can eye it and see more or less when you've removed half of the jar's content. So I did that, mixed and marked how tall it was. I also had a notebook to keep track of how much I was adding and removing daily, and also to record what were my impressions of the starter in terms of looks, consistency, smell. Basically, as much as I could document for future memory and self-reassurance more than anything because I can get easily distracted. And all you'll have to do is repeat this same process over days 3 through 5. If during these days you notice that your starter is doubling in size, then you should feed it every 12 hours. In my case, between days 3 and 5, I didn't really see that big of a change, but I kept repeating the process, meaning that I fed it every 24 hours. I think the weather played a big part on how my starter progressed because during this time the days were kind of cold. And I cannot lie, but by day 5 I started getting worried, but now knowing that it all worked, I shouldn't have worried for a second. On day 6, because the weather was still coldish, I chose to keep the starter in the oven after feeding it to shield it from the coolness of my kitchen as much as I could. And that helped. I could tell by the marks on the jar that at some point during the previous 24 hours, the starter had almost doubled in size. So from that point on, I started feeding it every 12 hours. And I did the same at the beginning of days 7 and 8 and put it in the oven again. And when day 8 was complete, I could tell that the starter had doubled in size, there were some big bubbles, and I determined that my starter mission had been a success. Then I removed half of it, fed it, and kept it in the fridge because I had a lot going on in my life during this time and couldn't make the bread straight away. So if you keep your starter in the fridge, you have to remember to feed it every week. And now my honest opinion about this starter, it worked amazingly well, but I found the recipe a little bit wasteful and I think I'll try to find an alternative, but I can't really complain because the end result of this sourdough was just great. And now let's make the bread. For this recipe you'll need 500 grams of strong bread flour, white preferably, or if you want more flavor you can use a mix of 400 grams white plus 100 grams wholemeal, 350 ml of room temperature water, 100 grams of active sourdough starter, fed and bubbly, and 1 tablespoon or the equivalent to 10 grams of salt. And because I had my starter stored in the fridge for a few days, I removed it one day before and fed it twice, with 12 hours in between each feeding. And for step 1, you'll need to mix the flour with the water. You can use your hands or a wooden spoon like I did, and the point here is that you mix until there are no visible dry bits. Then cover and let it rest for 1 hour. After an hour, add the starter and 1 tablespoon of salt and mix it well. I continue to use the wooden spoon, but if you're feeling handsy, why not use your hands? However, if you do that, I'd suggest that you wet your hands in water first to prevent the dough from sticking too much. Cover again and this time give it a 30-minute rest. And for the next 3 hours, at every 30 minutes, you'll do the stretch and fold, and it goes like I'm showing right here. First, dip your hand in water. Then, hold part of the dough, pull it up, stretching it, and then fold to the center. Repeat 4 to 6 times, making sure that you stretch and fold the entire perimeter of the dough. Summing up, in total you'll need to do the stretch and fold 6 times, and after that, you let the dough rest for 1 to 2 hours or until it doubles in size. And then you can do one of two things. You can either bake it straight away or keep it in the fridge overnight, which is what I did. But whenever you decide to bake it, you'll need a Dutch oven or another oven-safe type of pan with a cover. Preheat the oven at 230 degrees Celsius or 450 Fahrenheit and pop the Dutch oven in there with the lid on. And while it preheats, let's move on to step 4. If you kept your dough in the fridge overnight, remove it and let it sit at room temperature for 1 to 2 hours. Lightly flour a parchment paper and gently turn out the dough. If the dough is sticking too much, use a spatula or one of these scrapers to help it detach from the bowl. And I like to flour it a little bit on top as well. Then score the top with a sharp knife or blade. Besides the look, this helps the sourdough release air while it bakes. After about 10 to 15 minutes of preheating, carefully place the dough into the Dutch oven, cover, and bake. First for 20 minutes covered, then for an additional 20 to 25 minutes uncovered until deep golden brown. Cool on a wire rack for a while before slicing. But look at how beautiful it looks on the inside. I cannot find the words to describe how incredible this sourdough actually is. At this point I've made it a few times and it never disappoints. And I know it takes time, but if you have the patience, I promise that it will pay off. And that's it for today's video. If you had a good time watching it, don't forget to give it a like and consider subscribing to the channel. It was lovely having you here, and I hope you stick around for the next one. Until then, have a beautiful day. Bye bye.